Lucy.
Okay, right, I've disappeared, but that's fine. That's my ego gone down the line. I also shared a supervisor and did my PhD under Professor Graham Parkes, who Kevin did his PhD under. So we have that in common as well. And I don't plan to talk for as long as 15 minutes if I can possibly stop myself. And unfortunately, I'm also going to be reading my my text a bit. But the first thing, I suppose, I'll get this out there before we go any further, is that the idea of there being no them and us is a real challenge. I'm really interested in the practice of philosophy in response to the ecological emergency. So it's a challenge for me, and I'm proposing it. So I don't necessarily expect that it will be easy for other people to accept. It requires a radical reassessment of how one approaches situations. As you can see, I've quoted here from Mitch McConnell, who a couple of days ago said, we cannot keep drifting apart into two separate tribes, and we all know what happened next. Can we approach the ecological emergency instead of approaching it as a question of blame, judgment, increasing radicalization? Can we approach it as an emergence, an urgent and critical matter that calls for our full attention and reminds us that it is how we pay attention or realize that matters? I'm obviously not going to discuss whether or not the ecological emergency exists with this group, but I will at least clarify what I mean by the ecological emergency. And thank you very much, James, for the introduction. I use the phrase ecological emergency. It's a broader definition than most. I define the ecological emergency as encompassing both the environmental crises of pollution, deforestation, desertification, mass species extinction, and climate change, but also the human attempts to conceptualize this impact. In other words, how we see it. This linking of anthropocentric, human-caused change in both atmospheric or climate and ecological or terrestrial systems is not new, but it is also sadly uncommon as a representation in the media. In other words, the media tends to treat climate change separately from, say, extinction of species. And how we respond to this emergency isn't really considered part of that definition at all. So it's almost unheard of to take the extra step. Thank you very much for doing the slides, Alan. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. It was the philosopher Timothy Morton who came up with the phrase ecological emergency, but my definition is a bit bigger. It's not including just what is emerging externally to demand our immediate attention, whether this is storms and droughts. I'm in the Canary Islands at the moment for various reasons, and there's a massive amount of migration flow at the moment, and it's caused at least in part by these phenomena. But I also include the emergence of the awareness of our own response to this phenomena, how we respond to migrant masses and drought and increasing storms. So I also include the intersection of physical and social reality as it emerges into our awareness. And to a degree, that's what Kevin was talking about when he was talking about John Moriarty's response to culture. I don't reject culture in any way. We don't have any choice. We're in culture, but I'll come back to that. Physical reality includes ecosystem fragmentation, threatening natural systems resilience, and social reality includes attitude polarization and increased extremism. What is emerging urgently and critically in our own awareness is that these, the internal and the external, the social and the real, the us and the them, are not separate processes. They're interconnected. Indeed, the urgent emergence of our own awareness of our interconnectedness is a kind of key to how we can respond to the emergency. By realizing literally and metaphorically that we are none of us separate from either cause or response or from one another, that we're all entirely enmeshed and interconnected in the process, we can begin to consider our options. None of this is complicated. The explanation is complicated, but the actual options are not complicated, which is not to say it's easy. The next slide, please. Slide 3. My PhD research began under the late Dr. Tom Duddy in Galway in NUIG with an exploration of Paul Taylor's theory of respect for nature, which was outlined in his book of that name. And here on the screen, you will see a summary of that. My epiphany came gradually, if an epiphany can be gradual, as a result of Tom's untimely death and my having to find a new supervisor. I wanted to pause my research in order to grieve, but I had no money and I would have lost my grant. So in many respects, I had no choice. And then free will or choice became very important to my understanding of our response to the ecological emergency. Slide 4, please. I probably should have given you longer on slide 3. Respect for nature, Paul Taylor's theory, is a life-centered theory of environmental ethics. It consists of 3 interrelated components. First is the adopting of certain ultimate moral attitudes. In other words, he suggested we adopt respect for nature. Second is why should we adopt respect for nature? So it's a way of understanding the natural world and our place in it, which makes that attitude of respect appropriate to take. And third is a system of rules, moral rules and standards for guiding our treatment. So how do we actually behave when we understand our relationship with nature? The theory is structurally symmetrical with a theory of human ethics, a Kantian theory of human ethics based on the principle of respect for persons. Kant very famously said that people should be treated as ends in themselves. Now, slide 4, if you haven't already gone on to it, you'll see how my theory of eco-philosophical theory, it's a theory of eco-philosophy, it's not an environmental ethic, how that theory kind of emerged from Paul Taylor's theory. I completed my thesis, as I said, under Professor Graham Parkes in UCC, and he encouraged me to turn from environmental ethics, which is essentially analytical philosophy, to a phenomenological understanding. Don't worry about the word, of what was going on. He introduced me to the work of Dogen Zenji, who was a 13th century Japanese Zen master and author of the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma eye. So you can see it was quite a different approach. So my theory took Paul Taylor's theory, and instead of thinking about respect, first I thought about how can we see our species as entirely enmeshed with all other systems. I mean, actually that emerged through my research, that, you know, we are entirely enmeshed when you think about it, us as being evolved, and also us as breathing. We're not just organisms, we're also more than human, but we're also more than living. So second is the realization of what this enmeshment implies about our capacity to act as agents. I said earlier that I began to realize that I wasn't free in the way that I thought I had been. I took the radical step of saying we have no free will in the traditional sense. I told you this was challenging, and therefore we're unable to act morally in the traditional sense. So what's left? So third is understanding that the very act of realization itself is the source of our agency. So what does that mean? In Zen terms, this is the backward step. And if you just reflect for a moment right now on where you are, what you're doing, what's around you, what's brought you to this moment, then you are realizing. And realization is the backward step. That's all meditation is. You see, it's not difficult. It's very simple in essence, but it's a challenge to do all the time. So the next slide, slide 5, Dogen Zenji turned the traditional idea of working towards the Buddhist notion of enlightenment. Well, why is enlightenment suddenly part of this? Well, you'll, I hope, see in a moment. The Shobogenzo, all his writing is highly complex, challenging, and often paradoxical. It's mind-bendingly complex. But when you break it down, it says that we are already enlightened, all of us, human and more than human, and this is going to be a challenge. Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg, the polar ice cap, and the Sargasso Sea. What we need to do is realize this. So until you realize that you're enlightened, you can't escape the cause effect, cause effect, cause effect. And so you get behaviors like the behavior of Donald Trump. So he asked us to study to what he called practice realization, that we are all Buddha nature. But until we realize this, we cannot forget the self. And on the screen, I hope you can see this quote from Dogen Zenji, which is very close to what John Moriarty is saying, essentially. To study the Buddha, or to study the way, effectively, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. Okay, that's rather complicated. Is it? Or is it? Or when you forget the self, do you just forget that you're separate from what's going on around you, and you begin to realize that, you know, you're the breath coming in, you're the digestion going on, you're the hearing going on, you're the listening, you're the speaking, you're all these things that are happening, and they're not atomized, they're not just happening within your skin, they're the interaction of your ongoing experience. And when you realize that, then in a sense, no trace of realization remains, because it's just listening and doing and acting. So what can you do with this information? The next slide, slide 6, shows you where I went with it. I combined the research I'd done into Taylor's respect for nature, as I said, and therefore environmental ethics, with phenomenology, evolutionary biology, systems theory, and Dogen Zenji's and other East Asian philosophies, because I also teach yoga. And it became clear to me that responding to the ecological emergency, I said earlier about the practice of adopting an attitude of respect, I would say that the practice of realization points us towards attunement to a particular attitude. And our own attitude, our own way, the how of what we do is the important thing. It's rather like shifting the focus from goals. What do we want? We want harmony. We want to live in harmony with other people, with nature. We want to be happy. We want to be loved, for instance, to means or method. So it's not the end that counts. It's how you behave right now in this moment. It's how you're sitting, how you're breathing. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a famous text used by lots of yogis and yogi philosophers, Arjuna is a warrior prince, and he's advised by his charioteer, who is actually the god Krishna, not to concern himself with the outcome. Gandhi was very keen on this, and this is Gandhi's translation. Instead, focus on your attitude, the way that you're doing what you're doing. This is rather like shifting the focus from ends to means. If the end or the goal is not something over which we have control, it is therefore not the element on which we need to focus. We don't know where this ecological emergency is going to take us, but it's not looking great. But still, it matters how you engage at every single moment that you become aware. Rather like evolution, or as I will argue, enlightenment itself, there is no goal, there is no end to it. So slide 7 takes us a bit further. It's clear that in the context of our evolutionary biology, this is a bit of a jump to a different point of the thesis, but I hope you'll bear with me. In our evolutionary biology, we Homo sapiens do not stand atop an evolutionary pyramid. Most language is metaphorical. In a sense, all language is metaphorical, and we use metaphors all the time. So for a very long time, dualistic philosophy, and you've probably seen pictures of man and then the beasts below and the angels above. Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman, and in fact, a vast number of other philosophies and ideologies and spiritual systems had this sort of ladder or pyramid imagery. It's much better, and most of you already know this, to think of evolution as a tree or a bush where viruses are on one branch and humans are on another. We're simply evolving along with everything else. If we have any quest, if evolution itself has any quest, it's to avoid annihilation. Richard Dawkins' book was basically to say, you know, that genes work to get themselves to the next generation. In other words, we're not moving towards anything, we're moving away from our own demise. Individually, of course, that doesn't make any sense at all, because we can't avoid death. It's an 100% certainty, despite people attempting to freeze themselves, that ultimately you will die. So when you consider the evolutionary push, this fact becomes important. It's further fuel for the thought that rather than concerning ourselves with personal survival, which is a fruitless task, we must consider what we might do to avoid species annihilation. And that's effectively the question of the ecological emergency. It's what emerges internally. How am I going to cope with the fact that my species is on a careening course for annihilation? And we must also consider whether the limits to our annihilation end at our own species boundary. And as I've already said, and as John Moriarty and Kevin have already said, you know, interconnectedness implies that that boundary is illusory. So Paul Taylor concluded that respect was the most reasonable attitude, and I conclude that compassion is the most reasonable attitude. When, on slide 8 now, please, Alan, when you consider most of what happens in the universe, there have been locust swarms here this year, volcanic eruptions, so-called plagues. There is an action, and then there is a reaction. And that happens from the beginning to the end of the universe. In yoga, this process is called karma. And karma doesn't have any positive or negative connotation. It simply means action. You could say there's an action and then there's another action. We generally say there's an action and then there's a reaction. Our lives are action and reaction, individually and culturally. And it in a kind of snowball effect, it tends to take us in a particular direction. But the thing that pauses us, takes us out of this process of action and reaction, is precisely the fact that we can become aware of what's going on. Realization. Realization is the process that as soon as I draw your attention to it, you will notice how you're sitting, how you're breathing, and what is happening right now. In your own life, internally and externally, you realize. So you take what in Zen is called the backward step. You can go on to slide 9. Dogen was quite clear that there is nothing in existence which is not Buddha nature. There is no them and there is no us. This is similar to saying there is nothing that is not part of the flow of existence. Buddhism also recognizes that there is an element to this flow that is inherently compassionate. In a sense, the ground of being or existence itself is compassionate. Bear with me. Consider the universe in a Poincarean mathematical sense as a series of equations working themselves out, but then continuously not being able to quite balance, so having to continue to work themselves out. The fact that the equations of the universe, as elements in reaction or energetic systems in process, do not work themselves out in simple linear form, but instead are probabilistic, complex, and unpredictable, means that the universe itself does not simply begin at moment A and end a moment later at moment B. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't be here. Instead, it continues through, to our minds, almost infinite time and space. And the very fact of this time and space offers all the possibilities provided by the vastness of this space and time, the possibilities for planets, stars, galaxies, and of course, ourselves, maintaining existence over time and becoming aware. Scott Sampson, by the way, has done interesting work on this, and I'll give a reference to his work. In our own case, and perhaps also in others, although we've done little research into consciousness in other creatures, it offers the possibilities provided by awareness, consciousness, and therefore realization, or in the Buddhist sense, enlightenment. There is a kind of compassion, I hope you agree with me, in this. There is more compassion in the possibility offered by existence, after all, than by non-existence. And you'll see that I've quoted something about that on the screen. Just take a breath. Only one more slide left. Okay, so slide 10. There is only one act that we can perform that creates a shift in how we relate to this existence. And this is this very act of realizing, practice realization, of becoming aware again and again, time after time, of what we're doing while we're doing it. And this is our agency. Our realization, our becoming aware of what's going on while it's going on, is our agency. Because when we practice realization, we practice realizing that we came to where we are, not because we chose to or we wanted to. I didn't choose my parents, or that my supervisor died. And the rational response to that awareness, to whether I have been kind or whether I have screwed up in response to those things, is compassion. It's a rational response to my own awareness of my own and all enmeshment. And then when compassion is elicited or attuned to, possibilities arise. It's like mindfulness. You know, you're not just triggered by the next event. You have a micro space, and in that micro space, the possibilities arise that were not there. Well, they may have been there, but they were latent, they were hidden, that you might behave differently or kindly, for instance. You're still enmeshed, but the enmeshment has shifted. You can now see what needs to be done. And it's not as though you do it. You don't do compassion as much as compassion does you. I know that might sound a bit odd, but if you just take a breath, relax a bit, and think about being just a micro fraction kinder to yourself right now, what would it feel like? Would it mean that you relaxed your shoulders a bit more? And what would it mean if you were a little bit kinder towards the next person you met? It's not you doing it, it's you allowing the system that is cooperating with itself all the time, well, your systems cooperate, to work through you. You don't act independently any more than you did before the awareness arose. But now that you're attuned to compassion, the thing that is most loving, most compassionate, does what it needs to do through you or through me. It is the attitude of all of us, even those of us who think we're on the side of the angels, that matters if we as a species are to come into alignment with the flow of the rest of existence, including living existence, so that our species can explore its potential in the fullest way possible and mitigate at least some of the impacts it has had so far, largely harmful, on the rest of the systems that created and sustain us. My suggestion is that we open to the flow of all that is going on, but realize that we don't control that flow any more than we control the flow of our thoughts or what genes we have. And by learning to do this, we'll be at a place where we're ready to take on the reality of how we can respond to what is going on, including the ecological emergency, which includes, as I have said, attitude polarization, and particularly in politics, but also in social media and public life, and possibly in your relationships with people you disagree with. If we can practice Dogen Zenji's forgetting the self and attunement to compassion, then perhaps we can think like a planet, think like a virus, think like a we. There is no end, no utopia, no perfect situation in which humanity can live with all else. There is only attunement to compassion and letting love do what needs to be done. I'm going to end there. I've got a little bit more to say, but I'm just going to finish with a quote by David Mitchell. The last line of his book, Cloud Atlas, is, "My life amounts to no more than one drop. There is so little we can do in a limitless ocean. And yet, what is any ocean but a multitude of drops?"